Hello guys, in this video we are going to be creating a player list that displays the players connected to the session, and then we're going to make sure that for the server, so for the host, that he or she can kick the other players and cannot kick himself. So here you see that I am the host here and I cannot kick myself, but I can kick this player, and then you'll see the background change here because that will be the other map. So this guy gets kicked, the server player list automatically gets updated here, and you see that the client gets disconnected and goes into another session. Alright guys, let's get right into this video. So what I have in front of me right here is the default third-person Our Engine project. So if I click play, you can see that I can simply walk around. And in here, I'm going to set up the replicated player list. The first thing that I want to do is that I want to create a folder, and let's call this player list. So the first thing that we need is a game mode class. So let's right click, go to blueprint class, then type in game mode. And then this is the game mode that we want. And let's call it BP my game mode. And then inside of here we are going to have to set up some logic. So if you go to the event graph of the game mode, then we are going to need two events. So if you type in event and then scroll up a little bit, then see an event called onPostLogin and an event called onLogout. Now I made a separate video on these events to go into more detail about what these are, but eventually what it does is that, as it says here, it notifies that a player has connected and has been given a player controller. So this event is basically when a player has connected to your session, and then we also want the event onLogout. And this way we can now keep track of who connects and who leaves our sessions. And out of here we get a player controller reference, and out of here we get a controller reference. And then the second thing that we want to do is that we want to set up ourselves a little player controller. So go to blueprint class and click on player controller, and I call it BP, something like my player controller. Then the next thing that we want to do is that we want to assign our game mode inside of the level. So over here, go ahead and select your own game mode. Then click this open and select your own player controller. There you go. And then what we want to do is inside of the game mode, we want to store those players that are coming in. So the way that we're going to do that is from the new player here, we are going to cast to our BP and then my player controller. So cast to your player controller. And then this one here, we want to store it as a reference. So this is that incoming player controller. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to rename this variable to all player controllers. And then what we want to do is if we remove it here, we can then click on the variable and then we can make it of the type array. So now we have an array of all of my player controllers here. And then essentially what we want to do is as soon as a player connects, we want to add them to this array of player controllers so that this way we have a list or basically an overview of all of those player controllers that come into the session. And now we want to do the same when they leave the session. So essentially we have an array here. First of all, the host will start a session. So the host will always be at index 0. And then we will have clients connecting. So this would be your players coming into your match. And then when they leave the match, we want them to leave. So if you go ahead and copy paste this, then the XStick controller we want to cast to this player controller. And then instead of adding it, what we then want to do is call remove. And we want to remove an item. And the item that we want to remove is this player controller from the cast over here. So this is how we can keep track, like I said, of those player controllers coming in and leaving. So this guy might disconnect, then it looks like this. Then a new player might connect. And then we just have an overview of these players here. Okay, let's compile and save that. Then the next thing that we want to do is that in the game mode, we want to make ourselves a custom event. So right click and type in custom event, and let's call this update player list. And then what we're going to do is that essentially each time that a player connects or disconnects, we're going to call this little event here. So if you go ahead and type in update player list, then we want both of these events to call this. And then what I noticed is that, well, removing a player controller takes a little bit longer than adding a player controller. So removing an item takes a little bit longer. So because of that, we are going to install a tiny little delay here. And something like 0.3 seconds is enough. And then we can properly remove this. And then after that, we are going to call an update. And this update we are going to call inside of the GameState. And essentially the GameState is a class that exists on both the server and on all of the clients. And the GameState can therefore have replicated variables from the server replicating to the clients. So what we want to do is that we want to make a variable which is RepNotified. And then as soon as the player list updates, then we want the GameState to fetch all of the players essentially and then update all of the clients and the server itself as the host with the data that some players have potentially left or have come into the lobby. And this will be a lot more clear when I get into it right now. So let's do that. So what we want to do is we want to right click here and go over to Blueprint class and then type in GameState. Click on GameState, hit select, and then call this BP my GameState. Then make sure that you attach this class also here to your game mode. So in GameState, select your own GameState. There you go. And then we can go ahead and open up this GameState class. And then we want to create a custom event here. So right click and hit custom event and also call this one update player list. And then over here, we are going to be actually updating the player list. So back inside of the game mode, we want to call this event. So what we're going to do right now inside of the game mode is that we're going to type get game state. And then we are going to cast to our game state. So type in cast to my game state, just like this. And then we are going to call that little event called update player list. And then we're going to make the game state be responsible for actually updating that player list. Okay, so this works. And then another important thing to know as well, the game mode, which is the class that we are in right now, only exists on the server. So you cannot have replicated variables in here, simply doesn't work. You can also not have remote procedure calls, so events that run on server or multicast, it simply won't work because this only works on the server. So basically what I do right now is if I call this event update player list, and then if we then call it here update player list in the game state, then you see that this event is not set to replicate, but this event is executed on the server because it came from the server. So at this point here, we are still on the server, and because we are still on the server, we can then set a replicated variable and have that be replicated from the server down to all of the clients. So what we want to do right now is that inside of the game state, if you type in variables, then you see a couple of default variables over here that exist inside of the game state. And an important one for us is this get player array variable. And what this does is that it basically contains all of the player states that are inside of the current session. So if you get this, then every player that connects to your match has both a player state and a player controller. And the player state contains information about the player, and default information that the player state contains is a player name inside of our engine. So what you can do is that you can type in get player state to get your own player state. And then off of here, you can always type get player name. And this function over here returns the name of you in the subsystem. So if you use subsystem null, it will always return your PC name, and that might look something like WinPC and then a lot of numbers. And then for the second client that you might have running, it will return a second instance of that PC. So it will return another PC with a lot of numbers. But if you use Steam, for example, then this will return your Steam username. So if you have something like Steam Advanced Session plugin installed and the Steam subsystem set up in your default engine ini file, then this will return your Steam name. If you have EOS returned, then this will return your EOS, so your Epic Services username essentially. So that's something important to know. And then we can basically get all of the player names by using this get player array, which is all of the player states. And then for each player state, what you could do is, if you drag off of it, is that for each of these player states, you can then get the player names. So if I can type get player name, there you go. So this would return all the player names of the currently connected players to your session, essentially. But what we want to do is that we want to make use of something called a RepNotify to update all of the player lists for all of the connected players. So the way that we're going to do that is that we cannot RepNotify this variable, as you see. So we're going to promote this one to a variable that is self-made and set that one to RepNotify. So over here, go ahead and click promote variable and simply call this all player states. And then we're going to hook this up over here. And we're going to set it to RepNotify. And then as you notice, it becomes replicated. And then you also see that we get this automatic RepNotify function over here. And what that allows us to do is that as soon as the data changes inside of this variable, which it does because the game mode on the server calls this variable, server sets it replicated, which means for the clients, this variable will now go from having no data in here to the actual player data. So then this fires because the value changes. That means that then the attached function fires, which is this RepNotify function. And in here, if we then code logic, we can have that logic execute on everybody in the session. So both on the server and on all of the clients. And the logic that we're going to code here is updating the actual player list widget for us. So we'll get to that in a little bit, because right now we're going to have to set up that widget. So if we go back here, now we're going to make ourselves a little widget. So if we go to user interface, widget, user widget, then let's call this our player list. And we're not going to make it look pretty. We're just going to make it functional. And then we need another widget called widget blueprint player list item. So essentially you're going to have your player list. It might have a little scroll box in there, and then you want your player names to populate that player list. And you also want to be able to kick certain players. So we're also going to install a kick button here so we can kick specific individuals. So let's go ahead and first set up the player list over here. So like I said, we're going to keep it basic. So let's pull in a canvas panel here. And then we want inside of the canvas panel a little border. I'm going to drag it somewhere over here. I'm going to color it a little bit. So I'm going to say brush color, make it a little bit grayish like this. Then we're going to go ahead and drag in a vertical box, put some text in here. This text I'm going to say that it has to say player list. There we go. Then the vertical box over here, we're going to give it some padding. So something like 15 looks nice in my opinion. This text, we're going to give it some padding down. And then what we're going to put under here is ourselves a little scroll box. So put that under here. And this scroll box, we're going to set it to fill. And this is essentially the scroll box. So if you click here, scroll bar, then you see how that works. This scroll box will contain all of those usernames and kick buttons for the host to kick those individual players. So over here, we're going to rename this to player list underscore scroll box. And promote this to variable because we're going to have to code that. Okay, so that's all we have to do for the designing setup of this widget. Then we can go ahead, go into the player widget. And then over here, let's go ahead and drag ourselves in a little vertical box. And then inside of the vertical box, we are going to want a horizontal box. So just like this. Then the horizontal box, we're going to give it some padding down. So let's say 10 padding. Then right now we click here on fill screen, set it to desired, so we can see that what the actual size is going to be. Inside of the horizontal box, we want some text. And now you see that 10 padding that I gave to the horizontal box here. And what that does is that, of course, these names are going to like stack on top of each other, and this will keep them with some padding in between. So what this text will be is the username. And then let's also promote it to variable and call this the username underscore text. And make sure you promote it to that variable. Now we're going to drag in a button inside of our horizontal box. This button is going to be responsible for kicking the players. So if we rename this, we can call this kick player underscore button. And inside of the button, we want some text, and we want this text to say something like kick. I'm going to remove the padding from the text here, just like that. And then let's scale the text down a little bit because it's huge. So let's make this button text 16. Let's make the username also 16. And then what I want to do is that I want this button to have some padding on the left of it, so that there's a bit of space in between here. So select your button, go to padding, and then on the left, let's add 10 padding. Okay, so then one important thing to understand is that this button is only going to be visible for the host, because we only want the host to be able to kick players. We do not want clients to be able to kick other clients. So what we're going to do is that this button is basically is going to have to be invisible by default. So for all of the clients, they will just see this, and then the host will see this. So because only the host will see it visible, we're going to set the default value of the visibility here to be collapsed. Okay. As soon as we did that, we can then go ahead and also add a tooltip text so that when we hover over it, it says something. So over here underneath behavior, you can type in kick player. And then for the host, we want to get some specific different text in here perhaps. So right now, this design setup is also done. Now we can go ahead and scroll down with the button selected, click on clicked. And then we want our event construct event and our on clicked for the button. On event construct, we want to set the username in this widget. So drag in your username variable and type set text, just like this. Now the text, we want to promote this to a variable. So drag off of it and then to promote the variable and call this the username. Make sure that this variable is instance editable and exposed on spawn. That way we can fill in the data of this variable from another widget that creates this widget. So the player list is going to populate itself with these. So we want the player list to set this data. That's why we make it instance editable exposed on spawn. Okay, that's great. And then we want to do some additional logic. So on event construct, we are going to have to see if we are the server. So type in is server branch and then put that in here. You get a branch by holding B and left click. And if we are the server, then we want to see the kick buttons essentially. So we're going to grab that kick button. And then if the server is true, we're going to set the visibility of this button to be visible. So just like this basically. And let's comment that and say, make sure host sees kick buttons. There you go. But then what we don't want is that we do not want the host to be able to kick himself. So what we need to do is that we need to give these widgets here an ID of this actual player. So not only the username is going to go in here, but also an ID of this player is going to go in here so that we can identify who the host is and so that we can identify who we want to kick. So what we're going to do right now is that we're going to make a new variable here and we're going to make it of the type integer. And what we're going to call this variable is here, rename is player ID, just like that. And then essentially what we're going to say is if that player ID is equal to 0, then we are the host. And if we are the host, we do not want to be able to kick ourselves. So if the player ID is equal to 0, we then want to disable the kick button. So drag the kick button in and then type set enabled. There you go, and set it, keep it to false. So just keep it off like this. And then we also want to do something additional. So we also want to have the kick button tooltip text to be different. So set tooltip text and then hook this up like this. Boom. And then drag off of here and say make text. And then here make literal text. And then we want to feedback something like you can't kick yourself. Something like this. So just to make sure that the host understands that he cannot kick himself. Okay, there we go. So display that host can't kick himself and disable host's kick button. Okay, so what do I mean with that if the ID is 0, we are the server? Well, to get back to that, inside of our game state, we had this variable. And like I said, inside of the game mode, we connect. And of course, since the host is the one that hosts the session, the host is always going to be at index 0 of this array, essentially. And so also always at index 0 of this array inside of the game state. So at index 0, we can basically say that guy is always the host. And then what we can do here is if the player ID is equal to 0, which means that index is 0, then essentially we know that we are the host and we don't want to be able to kick ourselves. And then over here, we are going to install the actual event to kick ourselves, but that's going to be in a little bit. So let's go ahead, compile and save this. This widget is now kind of done. Make sure that your player ID also has instance editable and is exposed on spawn. Now we're going to go into the player list and we're going to code something so that we can actually populate this. So if you go over to your graph, you can remove all this, right click, type in custom event, and let's call this update widget, just like that. And then what we want to update here is that player list. So first of all, we're going to read the information from the game state. So this player list is now going to need a reference to the game state here to read this variable actually. You can also read this one because we set it with the same, of course, but we want to read, let's read the original variable. So what we're going to have to do is type in the widget get game state, and then we're going to cast to our game state. So cast to bp my game state, just like this. Boom. And then what we want to get from the game state is this variable that contains all of the players and their names. So we're going to type in get player array. Now this variable automatically updates itself. So when players connect or disconnect, this default variable is automatically updated with those players, with the player states essentially. So that's all of our players. Off of here, we're going to then do for each loop. And in between here, we want to basically clear the scroll box. So every time we refresh, we want to clear the scroll box and then populate it again. So what we're going to do is drag in our scroll box and type in clear children. Then we're going to hook this up in between here. And hook up the for each loop, just like this. Now that we got this out of here, we want to get the player names. And out of here will be that ID of the player. So index 0 is basically the host, index 1 is a client, 2, 3, 4, 5, all clients. And those are essentially their IDs, their indexes. So what we want to do is for each of these players, we want to create a widget. We want to create a widget, and it's going to be of the type player list. Now the owning player, you could leave it empty, but you can also just do get owning player. And then the username is going to come out of here. So that's the player name. And like I said, if you use Steam, it will automatically be your Steam name. And then here we can hook up the ID, just like this. And then instead of just creating them, we obviously want to add them to the scroll box. So grab your scroll box and type in add child. And then these created widgets are going to be added here as a child. Okay, that's perfect. Compile and save. And now we want to call this event every time that this variable gets updated here, and that gets updated when people connect or leave because of this event. So this calls this calls this, and then here we want to call this. So what we do over here is very simple. We're going to do get all widgets of class. Now the class of the widget that we want to get is the player list. Tick this off because otherwise it's going to only update player list widgets that are currently in your viewport. Let's say that you have a player list widget that is toggled away and that you toggle by using tab, which is very common in games. Then you also want to update that one the next time you pull up tab. You want that to be updated. So tick this off for that reason. Otherwise it's going to skip it. And then out of here, we're going to say for each loop. And for each of the player list widgets, we are going to call the update widget event. Update widget. And the reason it can be all this simple is, like I said, GameState exists on the server and on all the clients. So for the server, it's going to do this. It's going to find the server's widget and update it. For the number one client, it's going to do this, find that client's widget and update it for client number 2, and so on. So everybody will be updated this way. Okay, that's essentially it. Now we want to be sure that we can also kick players. So because we have now given this ID here, we can go back into inside of this player list item, and then we can set up that kick event. So essentially what we need to do when we kick, we want to get the ID of the player that we are trying to kick. And then that guy we want to actually kick. So let's install this logic inside of our game mode. That's a nice space to code this because that only exists on the server. And that way it's safe to have this type of logic here. So make a function and call it kick player. And when we're going to kick a player, we need to know what the ID of that player is. So click here, go to make it an integer type and call this player ID. And then what we want to do is that on that player, we want to call an event to make the player leave the game, essentially. So how we're going to do that is that inside of the player controller, go to your event graph, make a custom event, and call this something like OC, which stands for owning client, kick player. Now make sure that you make this of the type owning client and make it reliable. And as soon as this event gets called for you, we want to disconnect you from the match. So if you are in a certain map, we want to get you into another map. And if you're using sessions, you also want to destroy a session at that point. And maybe you even want to create a loading screen. So the way that you would do something like that is that you would do open level by name or object reference. And then here you would basically go to your main menu, if that's one of the levels that you have, of course. So if you have a level, something like this, and then you want to kick the player, so he goes from third person level back to the main menu level, that's that name. Then you would type in main menu level. And after you do that, when you're using sessions, you always want to call destroy session, because you're inside of an active session and then you want to destroy that session. And that's essentially all you do. But what we are going to do in this case is that we are going to, let's see, what's a good example here? Okay, yeah, we're actually gonna make that map and then have the player go to that map. So just as an example here. So let's duplicate this map real quick. Let's do Control copy, and let's call this then my main menu, right? And then I wanna go into this level over here. And what I wanna do is that I'm gonna make it look a little bit different. Something like this. Okay, now we understand that this is our main menu level. And this is our third person level. So back here, we want to go to the main menu and then destroy your session. I haven't set up sessions for this example, so I'm going to leave it out. But if you use sessions, make sure you set that up. And let's also just print got kicked. Okay, there we go. So now that this event is installed inside of your player controller, you can go back inside of your game mode. And then what we want to do is this ID here. We want to grab this player controller array from the game mode, and we're going to do get. And we want to get a copy of the player controller at that specific player ID index. And since we already cast it here, and since this is directly of that actual class, I can now directly call inside of the player controller this event called OC kick player. So over here, out of here, we're going to type in kick player. And this way the server will call this event on the owning client of the player controller, and the player controller will neatly disconnect himself or herself. There we go. And now all we want to do is that back inside of this widget, right, where you actually click that button, we want to call that event. So obviously only the server will have the button visible and will be able to click it if it is not the button for him or herself. So we can just simply type in get game mode, and then the server can cast to the game mode. Remember, it only exists on the server, so only the server can cast to the game mode. And then here we want to call that kick player event, which asks for our player ID, and we plug it in, and there you go. That's it, guys. That's basically how you do it. Now all we need to do is make sure that we add this widget to the player screen, of course. So let's go back inside of our player controller and do that here real quick. So if we do begin play, we can just set it up dirty like this. So let's do create widget, and we want to create our player list. Owning player, we can do ourselves as the player controller. We want to then add to viewport. And that's it. Oh, we also want to give ourselves a little mouse. So let's do set input mode game and UI. For us, we want to focus this widget. And let's also set our mouse cursor. So set show mouse cursor to true. This way we can see our mouse. Okay, now let's go ahead and test this setup. So with one player in standalone first, if I hit play, we see that, well, I am here right now. I can basically fly around and my player is over here. Let's actually go into the world settings and set up our third person character. I think that looks a bit nicer. So here we go. I can walk around and it says you can't kick yourself because me, the host, I cannot kick myself. I see my player name here. Now let's go ahead and test it in multiplayer. So if I do 2 players, go to listen server, hit play. Then we see that here on the right, we have the server, and here on the left, it is the client. So both of them see the server on number 1, and then, so the client basically sees the server and sees himself in the player list. And the server sees himself, which he can't kick, and the client, which he can kick. So there you go, guys. That's how you make basically a player list. If people now would join, it would automatically update, and we can also validate that by kicking this player. Then this list will automatically update as well. So here we go. We hit kick. This guy is now inside of this other level because you see we deleted all the stuff here. And you see that for the server here inside of this session, the player list has been updated. So there you go, guys. That's how you can make a replicated player list in Unreal Engine. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. That really helps out the channel. We're trying to grow the channel a little bit, so that would really help. And guys, we also have a Patreon if you're interested in checking that out. I'll upload the project files for this project on Patreon. And also, guys, be sure to check out our Unreal Engine store. We have a lot of very cool games and templates there that you can check out. That will help you and save a lot of time. And you can also reverse engineer these to learn more about our engine, or just to buy them for fun or add them to your game, of course. So guys, I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.